When making your film, it's always good to think about when and where you might want your title to appear. Whether it's at the beginning of the piece or all the way at the end, right before your credits. Speaking of end credits, the method that you'll see here to create the title of this piece can also be used for end credit creation, with very little modification. These methods are useful since we're wanting to stay inside of the engine for all of our post-production on this short. We don't want to finish our final frames in any other editing or VFX software. I'd like to focus on two different methods for getting 2D text as titles or credits into our project inside of Unreal Engine. So I've decided that I'd like my title to exist at the top of my piece here within the first 15 seconds or so on this nice long establishing shot I have of the view through the windshield of our spaceship, our colony ship. I'd like to place the title in the center of the screen approximately, and I'd like to explain the two different ways I can go about doing this. The first way is pretty simple. It's essentially going to be creating a widget blueprint that gets called through our blueprint logic and our level blueprint and is drawn onto the screen space that exists as the frame. So this does not exist in 3D space. It does not have 3D coordinates inside of our level here. It actually exists literally on the screen plane. We'll talk about the benefits and the drawbacks of that as we get into it. But the other method will be actually taking a plain actor here, dragging it in, creating a material that is then placed on that inside of 3D space, and that will come with its own benefits and drawbacks as well. So when you think about which way you want to do this, you're going to have to really sort of decide based off those pros and cons and the different sort of aesthetic looks you're going to get with either of those two options. I do want to say as well, if you want to create a 3D title, meaning using 3D geometry, you're going to essentially treat that the same way you would any other 3D asset in here. So we're not really going to cover that here. This is mainly about 2D text integration into your short film. Let's go ahead and take a look at creating and adding a widget blueprint at runtime, whether we're rendering out from Sequencer or creating an interactive version of our project. We're going to create this widget blueprint, add it to our viewport, and that will display text in 2D at the screen plane. So we're going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of this approach. So if we go here to the content browser, under content and titles, you'll see that I have a widget blueprint already created. I did that by right-clicking, going to user interface, and selecting widget blueprint. I named that titles UI. Let's go ahead and open it up and see what we have here. So this is our designer interface for our widget blueprint. We also have a graph mode that we'll get into in a second. This text right here is a simple static text widget that I've dropped in, sort of positioned inside of this canvas here. Under the details panel, I've named it title, and I've created a center anchor for it. So it's anchored into the middle of our screen here. Under content, this is where you'll actually type in the text content, like what the title is or what your text is. A lot of people think that you just double click here because we're sort of used to that in some other programs, but no, this is where you're actually going to enter the text. Now, I've added a little bit of custom formatting here so I could separate the letters a little bit further apart than default. And I've also changed the font to a font that I'd like to use for aesthetic purposes. This is a font that was not included with the engine, so if you want to import your own fonts, you need to do that in the content browser here. So I've created a fonts folder, and I've right-clicked and gone to import, and I've imported any OTF or TTF file. Those should work. And then if you're in titles again here, or any font family pull down menu, you will have access to those fonts. So once that's all done, I essentially have to figure out how do I want to animate this, because I don't want it to just pop up and disappear. I want to actually animate this title in and out. So I've done that by going to the animations tab down here, and I've created an animation by clicking on plus animation. I renamed that to title animation, and let's take a look at what that animation looks like here. So it's going to fade in, and then seconds later, let me fast forward just a little bit, it's going to fade back out. So creating an animation here is very simple, especially for those of you familiar with other DCCs that allow you to do motion work or typography work here. In this title animation track, I've added a new track. I've selected my title asset here, which was the simple static text widget named title. And I've added a track for render opacity. It's as simple as that. I'd set a keyframe by clicking on the Add Keyframe button at 0 seconds with a value of 0, and then at 1 second with a value of 1. Moving forward here, and I'm sort of scrubbing through this or moving my view here by holding down the right mouse button and dragging. All the way at 9 seconds here, I have one keyframe still at render opacity 1, so I've remained constant there. And at 10 seconds, I'm back to 0 with another keyframe, so that fades us out. Once this is done, we essentially just have to set up the really simple logic inside of our graph that's going to autoplay this for us, or call this as soon as this is drawn onto the screen and added to our viewport. So let's go ahead here and go to our graph editing mode, and I'll explain my setup right here. So event construct is essentially saying what is happening once this is created and added to the viewport. I created a play animation node. So I dragged off, let go, and typed in play animation to create that node. The target for our animation is going to be self. It's going to be this blueprint. So this blueprint itself. So you do not have to set anything there, but I will need to drag and drop from the animations over here in my blueprint, our title animation. I'll get that, which gave me this, and I connected it to in animation. I then did a delay, and then I have the remove from parent function, which will get rid of this from the screen and any reference from the instance that we've created, either by rendering or playing the interactive version of this. So you might be asking, why do I have this get end time into the delay here? Well, let me break that link real quick. The default duration for a delay as a function inside of the engine is 0.2 seconds as a float value. If I drag off of title animation and type in get end time, I will get a function that actually, as a float value, converts the duration of this animation. So if I want to be 100% specific to the actual duration of this asset right here, I would do that, connect it, and that way I'm making sure that my delay isn't premature or late. All right, it's happening exactly when it needs to, and then this is removed from the parent. Now that we have this set up, let's compile, save, and we'll actually exit out of this. And this is actually our level blueprint. So I'm going to show you how this actually occurs inside of our scene. So let me zoom out here a little bit, and we'll see that this is our level blueprint. This can be accessed by going to blueprints, then open level blueprint. This is where all the logic for the not only the interactive version of this short film, but just the general setup, including the setup for the UI. So off of event begin play here, I've disabled input because in the interactive version of this, I don't want people accidentally reframing the camera immediately, or if their controller is, lying on its side, the analog stick is bumped. I don't want any of that stuff happening. So I've disabled input at first. I've created the level sequence player that is going to play our master edit sequence. That's playing. This is my cinematic UI widget control. I'll connect this when I export my interactive version of this, but for this version right now, no interactivity. Imagining I'm rendering this through sequencer. I go to this delay node. I'm putting the delay node here because this tells me how long I'm waiting before I'm actually going to create my titles UI widget. Based off the flow of my piece, I've selected 5 seconds here. So from there, you can ignore this enable input because for our rendering, that's not going to make a difference. I've created a widget blueprint. So if we type in create widget, right? It's going to give me this node right here. And from the drop-down menu, I'm going to select the widget I just created, which was titles UI. I want to make it very clear that you need to connect the owning player to get player controller. That sort of determines whose screen this is being drawn upon. I've created a variable here for this title by right-clicking and promoting the return value here to a variable. It's a little bit more advanced of a concept, but I've done that here to basically store this widget as a piece of data if I need to reference it later on. But the main key here is that from the return value, I've added it to the viewport, which is going to draw it onto our player's screen, or the render screen, if you will. And then I've added a redundancy here with the delay. So after 12 seconds, this is a manual input. After this is done, because there's no way it's going to last longer than that, but just in case something makes this happen, I then remove it from the parent, which is the screen itself. So that allows us to essentially have this. So I'm going to press play here. And this is what's going to happen. We're going to fade up because this is all part of our sequence, our master sequence with the fade. And now our UI text is fading on. It's going to stay on for a little bit with the timing that I've sort of predetermined. And then it is going to fade off. And there you have it. That's really it. So what are the benefits for doing this as a UI element? Well, to me, it's the ability, to on the fly edit the text, change the fonts, change the size, change the color without any sort of complicated machinations. I can add much more design here by adding more text elements. I could even, if I wanted, drag and drop an image. I know this might sound counterintuitive, but if you've created your title with an alpha in Photoshop, you could actually select it as a texture and place that there and do the same thing with the animation. So this is pretty robust, but the main drawbacks you're going to get with this is that when we're in Sequencer and we're previewing, we're not going to see it come up. We're not going to see it drawn onto the screen. And B, it is not affected by your post-process volume or anything inside of the scene itself. And that'll lead us to the next method that you can use to create 2D text for your titles and credits. So another way that I might want to create my titles and credits more literally inside of the scene in a 2D way is by creating a material that has an alpha transparency that is placed onto a plane that is put inside of my level or scene here. So I'm going to unhide this here so we can take a look at it. As you can see, I have already brought in a plane from place mode that I've named opening title underscore plane. And I have placed it, rotated it, and scaled it to line up exactly where I would want it to be inside of this plane. You'll notice we do not have a material slotted in yet. That's what I want to do next. So let's go ahead and take a look at our credits material. So I'm going to open this up. This is inside of the content and titles folder. And what we're going to see here is an image that will essentially be utilizing its alpha channel. We're going to create a parameter here to be able to control the opacity. So the way that this works is I have created this baked image in a third-party program, and I have included an alpha channel. So I don't have to do any extra work. It's just coming in and it's just the title treatment. I've plugged in the RGB values here of this texture sample into my base color and also into my emissive color so it's self-illuminating. You'll notice if you have the result node selected, my blend mode is set to translucent, and that's so I can utilize this opacity control here. So the way that I've been able to create sort of a variable out of this is I've taken my alpha levels here and I've multiplied them. I've done an A to B multiplication with a constant node, which you can create by just right-clicking, typing in constant, that I have right-clicked and converted to a parameter. So this parameter has a default value of 1, a minimum and a maximum value as well. And I've made sure that I've named it opacity so I know what it is and I can identify it when I'm calling this in Sequencer. So this 0 to 1 value basically controls the opacity level of our material. And that's how I'm going to keyframe this in Sequencer. So this is a pretty simple setup. You can use this as a template. You can essentially just change out the texture here with your own, and this should work just fine. So how do I actually apply this though? So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to drag and drop this credits material onto the element 0 slot of our title plane, and you'll see that voila, it appears inside of our viewport as we're previewing. None of this having to be drawn onto the viewport, just like the UI. And the other benefit here is that this is affected by our post-process volume that's in the scene and any sort of lighting that we put into it if we want. All right. So that is a huge benefit of this. It's almost like legit physical actor inside of our space. But how do we keyframe the opacity of this material during our sequence itself? So let's do that by going over to our sequencer. I'm going to scrub through here and we're going to sort of see where we want this to fade up and fade down. Right now, a general fade is happening because I have a fade track on the subsequence here. But let's say that, a couple seconds in, I want this to come up, I want it to linger, and then I want it to fade out right as those light rays are sort of starting to come in and hit the chair and the bridge. So I'm going to essentially drag and drop my opening title plane actor from the world outliner into my sequence. And notice that I'm doing this in the master edit because this is everything put together. This is one of the last steps I'm going to be doing is adding these titles. So I'd much rather do that inside of our master edit than inside of some subsequence. So I'm sort of seeing this in a much larger, more global view. Once I have that in, what I want to do is add a couple tracks here. The first track that I'm going to add is for my static mesh component. That way I can add another track and unlock my element. And inside of that, I can unlock that opacity parameter and create a track for that, which is the parameter I created inside of the material itself here that was based off a constant. So if I go back to sequencer, you'll notice the default is set to 1. Let's go ahead and bring that to 0. And then let's go a couple frames ahead. I'll just sort of scrub through here and we'll change that value back to 1. And you'll notice it's visible now. And if we scrub through, we have a fade up, right? So we'd think then at the end, if we want it to fade down, we just need to reverse this process. Create another keyframe here at 1. As soon as this light sort of comes through here, I'm just watching the light, I'll get this back to 0. So if I do a little bit of a playback here, our general fade up happens. We start fading our material in. We hold. And then we slowly fade it out. So now that I have my text in here, another benefit that I'd like to sort of go over is that if the shot had any sort of camera movement, I've made the sort of decision that I'd like it to be static and more austere here, but there would be parallax with the text. So if your title shot does have Z-axis movement, you're going to generate some amount of parallax here, which will make the title feel like it exists in the world, which is kind of cool. But one thing I want to take note of here is that I will need to adjust my title placement. I do not feel that this will sort of compromise my vision here for the title if I just sort of slide it down just a little bit, just so it's a little bit more visible. Because with the post-process being added and the bloom and all that sort of stuff, if it's in the center of screen here, I'm losing quite a little bit of it, and I don't want to mess around with things by adding like a drop shadow or anything like that. So I've made the decision just to sort of bring it a little bit lower to give it some more contrast with the darker parts of the background here. But, these are two very simple ways for you to add 2D text as titles or credits into your film. Like I said earlier, if you do want to add fully realized 3D text elements, you would bring those in just like any other mesh, place them in the viewport here in your world, orient them, light them, add materials to them, just the same way you would any other 3D object in your scene. But for 2D integration, these are two methods that you can check out, and you can see what works best for your film. So the final thing I'd like to go over here, this is just sort of some housekeeping at the end, is making sure that if you've experimented with both approaches, so if you've experimented with placing a plane in and adding material to that and making sure that's keyframed in sequencer, or in your level blueprint here, you have initiated a titles widget to pop up with your text that is added to the viewport and then removed and animated, et cetera, et cetera. Just make sure that unless you're doing this for a very specific reason, if you've chosen one over the other, so in my case here, I've chosen to stick with the plane with the material on it that's animated in sequencer over the UI. I've made sure though that I've gone into my level blueprint here and I have disconnected the create titles UI widget from my setup. So that way they're not stacked on top of one another. I've made a distinct decision here. Now, if you would like to utilize both, you'll just have to sort of figure out how they're going to share the screen space. But in my case, I just want to use one of these. So now if I press play and I'm looking at this in the new viewport, the method that I've chosen, which is presenting this on the plane, is the method that's happening. So as we can see here, once again, it's affected by the post process. It's in my correct position here, and it will fade out right before those UI displays pop up there. There we go. So last thing to be aware of, just make sure that unless you are doing that for a specific reason, you've disabled one or the other when you've made your choice.